Mr. President, may I begin our conversation by taking you back many years? How was it like growing up in a house where your father was, doing so many things? He was lawyer, journalist, diplomat.
Yes.
He was a signatory to ASEAN. Can you describe how it was like growing up in that beautiful house with this wonderful man as a father?
Well, in our younger days, talking at when I was age 6 to 12 in grade school, we lived in the province.
Right.
And my late father was a struggling young lawyer with his private practice, but he also started a community-based newspaper, print. And my mother was an English school teacher in the provincial high school. Anyway, when the old man wouldn't sell all the papers, they would be stocked up in the house, and that's where we slept, on the newspapers that were not sold.
Wow.
Because we had to give up our beds to visitors from elsewhere who were in town.
Right.
And that's politics, you see.
Sure.
Anyway, all of that combined to give the three of us, the children, I was the oldest, a very balanced Philippine, provincial, and also city upbringing.
So you were related to Marcos as a cousin. And the relationship was, I assume, cordial, but did he go through a kind of trauma as well?
Maybe he did, but not me. But
There were differences of opinion, right?
I grew up as a high school student during the Japanese occupation, and he was one of us in the hills.
Right.
He was a guerrilla leader in a certain section of the northern part of Luzon, which is my part.
Right.
And he was very good at it. But after he started being successful as a political leader, first senator, Senate president, after that president of the Philippines, I think he lost his original direction of a really democratic and inclusive Philippines, where everybody would enjoy the same or equal opportunity. Because in his later years as president, he declared martial law to ensure his continuity in power.
Yes.
Or continuation in power. And that is when some of us professional officers, by that time looking at the year 1973 to 75, started questioning the abuse of government power, which included abuse of the armed forces, of which I was a very senior officer by that time, you see. I headed the Philippine Constabulary and Integrated National Police back in as early as 1979.
Yes.
1983, Senator Benigno Aquino was assassinated, and the question came, who was the mastermind? And many fingers pointed at the presidential palace.
Sure.
So at that point, I decided I better follow my conscience. Never mind the relationship and friendship of earlier years. But we tried to do it in a, call it non-violent, call it harmonious way, by plenty of negotiations and discussions and all that, including there inside the palace. But the breaking point came in the third week of February 1986,
Yes.
when we had to declare our withdrawal of support from President Marcos under the leadership at that time of the Minister of National Defense, Juan Ponce Enrile.
Yes.
And I joined him without any hesitation.
You must have been quite shocked, right? Because on the one hand, you had to do the very difficult job of, in a way, ensuring that the martial law was effective, while at the same time, and quite quickly realizing that it was, in fact, quite horrific.
You are correct. The Constitution called for our enforcing the legal laws
Right.
of the country. But when we perceived that some of the commands coming from above were no longer legal based on the Constitution or our system of laws, but already personal in nature, that's when I think the greater part of us in the armed forces rebelled. And it had to be me to gather them, mobilize them, and inspire them to
You know,
join the ranks of the rebels.
Yeah.
It was not an instant decision
Right.
that made me join the rebel group. And the favorable circumstances to break away happened when Mr. Marcos declared to the world that in order to remove the complaints against my administration, which was a martial law administration by that time, on its 14th year,
Yes.
he said, we will have a snap election in February 1986.
That's right.
And so everybody welcomed it, including the rebels and the opposition. Now, when it turned out that Mr. Marcos officially had won the election by a big margin, it wasn't really that way in the eyes and ears of the alternative commission on elections. They had a different count. And it had seemed that Mrs. Corazon Aquino, this lady here, had won.
Yeah.
And Minister Nili said so in public, in a press con. Yeah, I know that because in my region she was cheated.
Right.
I didn't say words like that because
Yeah.
I was not involved in the election process.
Yeah.
But as armed forces, vice chief of staff, I knew that there was some manipulations
Right.
in the electoral field by the civilian commissioners. So,
When you heard of the People Power movement, what were your thoughts as a professional person?
I did not hear of the People Power movement
No.
because we invented the movement.
Right. You were there at the
It
center
was
of it.
only, however, some civilian leaders who invented the term People Power Revolution
Right.
at EDSA, which
EDSA
is this
one,
main
yeah.
highway, okay? And so we exploited, the term people power. We played on that theme continuously in our pronouncements to the troops, to the civilians, supporters or otherwise, and to the whole country, because this is a very disconnected country, as I told you.
Yeah. Is it true that the church was quite involved in all of this?
The church, yes, especially the Catholic Church,
Right.
because of the role played by Jaime Cardinal Sin,
Right.
who was the number one
Yes.
Catholic spiritual leader here
Right.
at that time, and he was supported by all the clergy of the Catholic Church, but also the other religious denominations were very much into supporting the rebels. The Protestants were there in full force, the Muslims especially, because we had them in our armed forces in a very big way. They were there in our southern main island of Mindanao.
Sure.
And the Aglipayans, who were the offshoots of the Philippine Revolution against Spain
Right.
in 1896. It was at that point when everybody seemed to be united.
Right.
And to me, that was very miraculous because we had not attained that state of harmony
Right.
in the country at all during my time as a professional soldier. The pieces of the operations, or call it the jigsaw puzzle, like here, seem to start to fall in place, very fast.
Right.
And so in 4 days, we were able to convince I would say 99% of the armed forces to join us. And what remained with Mr. Marcos was his palace guard
Right.
under General Fabian Ver, who was also at that time Armed Forces Chief of Staff.
Right.
But they realized that it was the people around them pushing them to get out of the country and relinquish the position of president.
So from Marcos, we moved on to Corazon Aquino. And everybody thought that in the first few years she was doing very, very well. But towards the end, there was some belief that she had somehow not always lived up to the high ideals and expectations. How did she strike you as a leader in action?
My predecessor, Cory Aquino, is being blamed for the condition of brownouts or blackouts, call it, for a period of about 2 years in the Philippines. Now, that shortage of megawatts came because she canceled the nuclear power plant project entered into by Mr. Marcos before her time, good for 600 megawatts.
Right.
Because in our 87 Constitution, the use of nuclear power, whether peaceful, productive, or warlike, was completely prohibited. Now, that's one point. The other point is that she suffered because of the unrest in the armed forces at that time from 9 attempted coup attempts. I must say that we were able to prevent all of that, or avoid them, or preempt them, or somehow managed to prevent this by more dialogue with the people who had complaints against the government during my time.
Right.
But I must say overall that she must be considered an icon of Philippine democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I mean, for many years, you were the supreme commander, as it were, of all the armed forces and all of that. What made you, if I may ask, what made you want to join politics, and eventually, of course, you became president?
My progression from just being a professional soldier as a general officer to being president,
Right.
well, took a period of maybe 4 or 5 years.
Right.
After the EDSA People Power Revolution in 1986, I was elevated to the position of Armed Forces Chief of Staff. But the time came when our President, Corazon Aquino, needed to appoint a new Secretary of National Defense. So I was chosen to be that one. And I served in that capacity for more than 3 years, until I had to resign because I decided I'll go for the position of president during the first election under our new constitution, which would take place in June 1992. Now, at that point, many of my followers talk about the active soldiers and the retired officers were telling me, General, why don't you just grab it? We are still around and you have the armed forces behind you. And the people will probably applaud you for doing so. Why are you still going to the election? I said, no, we might win it and keep it for another 2 or 3 years. In fact, I can write the strategy for you on how to do it. I know how to do it, but I won't do it.
Right.
Because we won't last that long. The people will not want it. We will have a repeat of the Marcos regime of 20 years in their minds.
Right.
Because it's just like the formula in so many other countries where the head of the military takes over as president by just grabbing it. I said, no, we will not last that long. Now, after 6 years as president, following my very lucky victory in May 1992, there were no longer coup attempts, there were no longer violent movements. We were at peace with ourselves and with most of the world. In 1998 comes the next election, and because we had proven ourselves at fairly good at governance, The same supporters said, hey, why don't you just grab it now? Never mind the coming elections in 1998. You may not succeed in maintaining your administration. So I said the same answer. Yeah, we might succeed in keeping it for another 2 or 3 years. But, I said, when I'm gone, and I'm talking about expiring, your children, your grandchildren, your children, and my own children and grandchildren will all be gathered and put in jail. And I won't be around to defend them anymore.
Sure.
So let's go for the election. That's the way we are. We are built in the Republic of the Philippines.
Right.
And it's still like that up to now.
You have two examples of leadership, the Marcos way of governing and the Aquino way of governing. When you came, the shift in emphasis also suggested quite a shift also in the way you perceive what leadership was all about. Would you agree with that? That your idea of what makes a good leader for a nation was quite different from what you thought perhaps had made Marcos go the wrong way and Aquino maybe neglect a couple of priorities. What would you say?
In the case of Mr. Marcos first, he progressed or declined, let's put it that way, from a very democratic kind of leadership, starting in the provinces, in the grassroots, because that's where he came from. And my mother is his auntie, very close, to eventually a military dictatorship. In the case of President Cory Aquino, and I must credit her for being the political leader as president during her time, she did not go deeply enough into the grassroots to learn the sentiments of the soldiers, the communist enemy, the common people who had been deprived of lands, of livelihood, and of opportunities out there in the poorer provinces.
Right.
Because she didn't have the early training to do all that. I did have all of that background as a soldier because I was assigned to many parts of the Philippines. I commanded all kinds of troops. And when I opted to run for the presidency, I had rounded the country, province by province, maybe 5 times, you see. Right. That takes a lot of time. Anyway, I had that advantage. I found out about the sentiments of our people through my personal observations and experience. At the same time, one of the very first things I did during my administration was to appoint a National Unification Commission under a lady lawyer, professor in the University of the Philippines, who went around for 6 months interviewing people who were the leaders of the insurgency, but also the victims, and also the more prominent people in those areas. But all in all, we got a very good overview of the condition of the Philippines at that time, and we worked on that. And I must say that in our 6 years as a country team, with me as the president from 92 to 98, we were able to pass in Congress, approved by the president, 229 reform and structural laws, which remains a record up to this time in terms of the 6-year period of a presidency.
Right.
And many of those laws are still in effect because they were good to begin with.
When I read about your priorities during the term that you were president, I find 3 areas which were, to my mind at least, prioritized by you. Correct me if I'm wrong. One was trying your best to eliminate poverty or at least reduce poverty. 2 was trying to bring in mass education as a very key developer in terms of the nation's growth. And the 3rd was trying to contain the problems in the south with the communists and other kinds of rebels, whether they're the Moro rebels. Which would you say was the most challenging for you of the three?
First of all, the problem of peace and order countrywide.
Right.
And the most serious was the one in the south
Right.
because of the separatist rebellion
Yes.
of the disaffected or unhappy Muslim communities.
Right.
And at the same time, ongoing in the same place was the communist insurgency,
Right.
which was rather strong in that part because of the isolation, you see. What we did was to first attend to the peace agreement with the Muslim rebels. And this was done in September 1996, 4 years after I came in.
Right.
A very important aspect of that was the bringing in of firearms in the possession of Muslim rebels, New People's Army communist insurgents, and rebel soldiers. And I felt, because we had been doing this even before I was Chief of Staff and Secretary of Defense.
Sure.
We must give a financial aspect to the program, which would help these rebellious soldiers of various colors pursue a livelihood of dignity and, of course, a little adequacy.
Right.
And so we established what we call Balik Baril, or Return Firearm Program.
Right.
We knew it was dishonorable for Muslims to sell their firearms.
Right.
The same with our rebel soldiers and the communist insurgents.
Sure.
So we devised a program where an assault rifle, say an AK-47 or an M16, could be used as the collateral for a loan from the Philippine National Bank. But we took the risk because we said these guys are fighting the government not because of the ideology or religion, but because of their economic condition, which is very poor.
Right.
They cannot afford to live and develop their families on a few pesos a day. We made it very clear. We're not buying your firearms and you're not selling your firearms. We're lending you money and the firearms is the collateral. And so, we don't expect you to repay the loan, but do not expect the government to return the collateral, which is your firearm.
That was very,
But
very
accompanying
important,
that program, we had an integration program for the rebels and insurgents, soldiers, communists, and Muslims to join our armed forces
Right.
if you were qualified under the law. As far as we know, none of the integrated insurgents or rebels, after they joined the armed forces and the police, ever shot a fellow soldier or killed a Christian officer or went amok. In fact, the most senior among them, who was a Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF general, was absorbed into our armed forces as a reserve brigadier general. His name was, or is still around, Yusuf Jikiri. He was made the deputy commander of our southern command there in Mindanao to oversee this program of integration. And he did so well. When he retired, he ran as governor of the province of Sulu, which is the hotbed of the Muslim rebellion. The Abu Sayyaf are there. Normi Suarez from there. Yusuf Jikiri was elected as provincial governor.
Wonderful. And the other two, the economic poverty issue and the education, those were easier.
Well, okay. Now we go to that. The education we felt was lacking in terms of the basic preparation of a young person so that he could gain or earn a job here as well as abroad. So we introduced what we called TESDA, Technical Education and Skills Development Authority.
Yeah.
It was in between grade school, high school, which was 10 years only in the Philippines, and university. But this afforded the poorer ones who could not immediately go to the university, but they were high school graduates, to go into vocational work.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And earn the skills to be employed here as well as to be competitive abroad.
Sure.
And the courses that were developed here are still very important here, like carpentry, refrigeration, electrical work, organic farming,
Right.
garment making
Right.
for the ladies,
Sure.
and a little home care and health care.
Now, concerning the economic.
On the economic,
Yeah.
I mentioned the need to capitalize certain businesses, especially infrastructure, and we developed build, operate, transfer.
Right.
Pretty soon that became build, transfer, operate,
Yes.
meaning you transfer early the ownership to the private investor, and then they operate it from then on. They earn it or they gain ownership earlier. And then we had build, operate, manage. There was no transfer of the ownership. It remained with the government.
What about the foreign workers, the people that you sent abroad?
Yes, talking about
Yeah.
1993, when I made my first state visit to the U.S., we had 1 million plus overseas workers
Right.
in a population of about 76 million.
The home remittance was huge,
That's
right?
less than 10%.
Yeah.
No. Over the years, however, because of the dysfunctions of government after my time, the number of overseas workers increased.
Yes.
Until now, there are about 10 million plus over there, or 10% of our population of 100 million.
Right.
And that's terrible because there's a big social cost connected with that, as you know. This is the unhappiness of families and the communities. And that's the situation now. There are more now seeking work overseas, proportionally speaking, than before.
Right.
And that must be a problem that this government must now address.
In your eyes, what do you think would make an ideal president for the Philippines today?
Now, in terms of the current president now, I'm just saying very simply,
Right.
I said, hey, you're not just the president, you're not just the commander-in-chief, you're not just the chief executive, but please listen, you're also the skipper of our ship.
Yes.
And the cabinet, your allies in Congress are the crew. And please remember, we are all on board, including the elderly, including the disabled, including the newlyweds, because they're still on their honeymoon and they're unborn, you see. And also the retirees like me. And we want you to navigate our common ship on which we're all on board. It's the ship called Pilipinas. It's the only one we have. To navigate across the stormy seas and the rocky shoals so that we reach the promised land. And what's that? It's a better future with equal opportunity for the young ones, the older, elderly, and everybody in between. And so, we will help you navigate. And I'm telling all the others, if you see a hole in the ship, you plug the hole by yourself if you can. Do not add any new holes. That's the way we should be, as one country crew or one country team. And I hope people will listen to me.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.